When you say that you had Trump derangement syndrome going into 2016, like what does that like metamorphosis look like?
It's extremely painful to admit you're wrong. It really hurts. I was like, this is the most dangerous possible thing a person can read, and if a person actually encounters this and takes it seriously, that person will lose all their friends, and that is literally exactly what happened. I'm like just begging people to recognize that someone with $50 in their bank account is not wrong about what policies help them and what policies hurt them. Like, let's just bring a little bit of humility to this conversation and stop lecturing people who are poor.
Today on the podcast, I have Batya Ungar-Sargon, who is the author of Bad News and Second Class, and we discuss how she squares being both pro-Trump and a Marxist, and how class politics are at odds with race politics. Batya, thank you so much for being here.
It is an absolute pleasure to join you, Rikki. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. So first question for you is, I have to admit you're a politically very confusing person to me.
To me
so
too.
Can you self-define, like for a listener who might not be familiar with your work, like how you identify politically?
I would say identify as a populist. I would have said a left-wing populist until a year ago, and now I just say populist. Not because I don't still feel left. I still feel like I'm the real left, but the left in America is so desiccated right now and associated with so many things that I don't think are left, but I also think are contrary to the economic and cultural needs and concerns of working people, which is what it's supposed to mean to be left. So I would just say I'm a populist now.
Okay, and so you're kind of the person that proves the theory that the spectrum is like not really a line and more of a circle, and you're like at some point in the circle. When we last spoke for the Post, I think you described yourself as a pro-Trump Marxist. Is that also still something that you identify with?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. The New York Times had a piece, and in it, the author said, I know what the CEOs truly believe about Trump. And the point of the piece was Trump sucks because CEOs hate him and the heads of Fortune 500 companies hate him, and therefore you should too. And to me, it was sort of like, it's so amazing to me that we're living in a time where what it means to be a liberal, to be a member in good standing on the left, like a New York Times reader, is to be taking your moral cues from CEOs. But there was one paragraph in this piece that actually was 100% accurate, the most accurate analysis of why Trump's voters like him that I've seen in the liberal media. And what he said was, Trump is a lot closer to Karl Marx than he is to Adam Smith. He believes that the government's role in the economy is to protect working class labor. That is the role of government. And so he likes tariffs. He doesn't like free trade. He likes trade wars. He doesn't like immigration. He wants to create an economy that protects the working class. And to me, that's very Marxist in nature. And so I think that's pretty accurate, yeah.
And like, how do you think someone like Trump was able to ascend so suddenly in the Republican primary in 2016? Was that something that you anticipated? Did you think that your populist kind of viewpoints were as widespread and shared as they evidently are on the political right, or did that surprise you?
So back then I was definitely more liberal and more left, and so I had the Trump derangement syndrome for a while. I definitely did not see him coming. But I've asked Steve Bannon this question because to me the question is not how did Trump manage to rise? The question is how did he manage to accurately identify where the American working class is at in a way that was so compelling that he just wiped the competition away. He understood before anybody else that the Republican voter, the average Republican voter, was no longer a rich country club person who owns a yacht, but was rather the American working class who had been abandoned by the Democrats. He understood that somehow before anybody else did, certainly before I did. And so I think that's really the question, is how did this person get to understand that about the American public scene. And what Steve Bannon told me was he has a genius for reading the crowd. And he started going to CPAC and he just would give these talks and he would meander and he would wait to see which lines the crowd responded to.
Yeah.
And instinctively picked up that the free market, free trade, Chamber of Commerce, foreign wars version of the GOP was dead. I mean, that was still what the donor class wanted, but not what the voters wanted anymore.
And so, I mean, for me going into 2016, I feel like I had a completely different set of sensibilities. I was 15 in the lead up to that election. But the reason that I pretty early on said, I think this guy's going to win was like not because I had any sophisticated economic understanding at that point in time, but because I think I grew up in an era where political correctness was really like fresh and new, and the boundaries and the lines you couldn't cross were newly defined and very strictly enforced. And it was, at least for me as a teenager, I was supportive of him when I was younger. I'm no longer now. To me, it was so refreshing to see someone just be like, fuck it. Do you think that, like, how do you think that appeal and just the brashness of his politics, like, plays into his appeal? And do you think that that's something that more people are going to start to kind of emulate in the political sphere?
We've definitely seen people trying to emulate it, but they've crashed and burned, which to me is proof that that is not what his real appeal is. So Ron DeSantis, for example, great executive in Florida, but when he tried to take the national stage, he thought that the thing that people like about Trump is that he's brash and not PC and is willing to take on the wokes in a rhetorical, symbolic manner by being rude. Yeah. And that is not what people like about Trump.
Yeah, but also DeSantis' delivery sucked. Like, with Trump, I feel like he kind of means it and he's funny in a way that, like, even, like, I have to admit. But, like, DeSantis just, like, has, like a stiffness about him when he tried to mimic it.
It's true. Like he couldn't really quite deliver the lines in the same way, but I think even if he had, he wouldn't have gotten much further. The Republican primary was fascinating because what it had was Nikki Haley representing the old version of the GOP, and she outspent Trump 2-1, okay? So all the money was in her camp. Then you had Ron DeSantis, who had picked up on these sort of cultural, symbolic piece of things, but failed to understand that what actually makes Trump extremely successful as a politician is his economic agenda. And when I traveled the country interviewing working class people for my book, Second Class, what I found was that is what people talked about when you asked them, why did you vote for Trump? They would say, because of tariffs, because of tariffs he put on steel and aluminum, because of the trade war with China, because he's bringing back manufacturing, because he got rid of NAFTA. The number one predictor for whether a county would go for Trump was a combination of how much the community had been decimated by NAFTA and free trade, which was reflected by the deaths of despair in that community. And so these things are very front and center for the working class mind. We in the elites tend to see things through a cultural lens because our economic concerns are being met. Because we have money in our bank accounts, we have a roof over our heads, and we have food in our refrigerators. Working class people just do not have the luxury of voting on these cultural issues. They vote on economic issues. And what happens is because their economic issues and their economic interests are in tension with those of the elites then accuse them of voting, against their economic interests on cultural issues. But the truth is that in America, the cultural divide is actually a smokescreen for an economic divide, an economic gulf separating the haves, which are the sort of over-credentialed college elites, from the have-nots, who are the working class.
And so what do you think is the differentiation of a working class person who ends up voting Democrat then, or registering as Democrat? Like what makes someone fall on one side of the line or the other? Because obviously there's, especially in urban areas, like the working class tends to tack left.
I would argue that a lot of poor people tack left, people who sort of live off welfare, off the government. Of course, it's very much in their economic interest to vote for the Democrats because the Democrats support expanding welfare. That's something that the dependent poor likes, but the working class does not. This is very hard for people to understand. The economic incentives of the dependent poor are in radical tension with the economic incentives and needs of the working class. Working class people really don't like welfare because they feel like they're paying for it while working really hard, and other people are consuming it while refusing to work. So I would argue in these urban centers, the Democrats get a lot of poor people who vote for them. They get fewer working class people who vote for them. But of course, there are working class people who vote for Democrats. I interviewed a lot of them for my book. And there are a number of reasons for that. There are a lot of people who work in public sector unions. So these are unions for public sector jobs. So people who work for the government. Of course, they're going to vote for Democrats because Democrats believe in expanding the government and more government jobs and more government benefits as opposed to the Republicans. The other reason that I encountered very, very often was healthcare. So if you're a working class person, the big barriers to accessing the American dream are housing, healthcare, retirement, and education. And if you're a working class person who has, let's say, a child who has a disability or an elderly parent who's very dependent on government services, the Republicans never, ever talk about that. And the Democrats do. And so a lot of people feel tethered to the Democratic Party because they are the ones who are at least willing to talk about healthcare, although it's been a long time since they've done anything on that front.
And do you see a world where like a populist right could take on that issue head on, or do you think that there's too many barriers to that?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of interest to do that. Yeah, the most common set of views I encountered in the people that I interviewed for my book, and this was whether they were Republicans or Democrats, there was virtually no difference in their views. The Democrats wanted much less immigration, and the Republicans wanted much more access to healthcare. So the first candidate to come out the gate and say, I am running on much less immigration and much more healthcare is going to get like an immediate 60% of the vote. That is where the American working class is at writ large. Now, instead of having a candidate who speaks to that, you've got one party that opened the border but will talk about healthcare, and another party that believes in policing the border, but will never talk about healthcare except as a slur. But the thing is, so this is the message of my book, right? Is the working class is in the middle. They're radically, radically tolerant, radically, radically moderate people. They're super pro-gay and very worried about trans. They want much more access to healthcare and much less immigration. They're very pro-life, but very anti-banning abortion. So they're in this radical, moderate middle. And it would be so easy for the Democrats to reclaim that position because that's where the Democrats were in the 90s. They did not support, third trimester abortions. They did not support open borders, the opposite. They supported policing immigration because they were the side of the working class. All they would have to do is go back to where they were in the 90s, but they don't want to do that. Instead, Donald Trump showed up and said, whoa, the entire Democratic platform of the 90s is what, just here for the taking? Okay. And he ran with it, and he's now getting voters who were Democrats 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 4 years ago, right? A lot of people. So I think if the Republicans can understand this, there's very little incentive in the Republican donor class to understand this. It may take a few election cycles where they try to go back to the pre-Trump version of the GOP after Trump, and that's going to be very painful. But they need to understand that their base is now hard-working American men and women who deserve a shot at the American dream.
So it feels like to me, I think of you as someone who puts a voice to like an oft like denigrated group of people who were the people who voted for Bernie in the Democratic primary and then moved to Trump, which I think like the narrative was like, oh, they're obviously very confused politically. But like, I feel like you put a voice to them. Can you explain that sort of psychology of like how you could be sympathetic to both like supposedly diametrically opposed candidates?
Right. So we have a grid by which we like to think about politics in America, where one axis is economic policy and one axis is social policy, right? So you can be, socially liberal and economically liberal. You could be socially conservative, economically conservative, socially liberal, economically conservative, and socially conservative, economically liberal, right? So when you think about things as being aligned in this neat grid, right, it's obvious that, these people don't fall in the same categories, right? I would say Trump is kind of in the populist corner of economically liberal, socially conservative, and Bernie is in the liberal, where he's socially liberal, economically liberal. But the truth is that is not how working class people see politics. So first of all, they're very, very socially liberal, not in the way that a lefty would recognize, but I would argue that lefties today are not actually very liberal. It's very like my way or the highway, right? So they don't believe that they should be engaged in a debate with people about whether trans women belong on women's sports teams, right?
Yeah.
They think that they should just be able to call you a transphobe and have their way, right? That's kind of the mentality. That's not very liberal. Meanwhile, working class people very much believe in having the conversation. They work and live in communities with people they disagree with. It would never occur to them to hold that against somebody. They really have a very live and let live mentality. So they're very supportive of gay marriage. Even Christians, I met a lot of Christians who are very supportive of gay marriage. The thing they don't like about wokeness is that it is illiberal and that sort of rankles them the wrong way. So they're very tolerant. Again, on the question of abortion, for example, I met a lot of women who said to me, I would never get an abortion. It's against my views, it's against my ideology, it's against my religion, but I would never judge that woman for making a different decision than me, right? Like that is the working class American mentality. And so, Bernie's kind of bluster and his sort of, live and let live kind of, that would not have been a turnoff to them. He talked a lot about healthcare, which is extremely important to working class people.
Yeah.
He talked about hardworking people in the same way that Trump does, as though they are worthy of respect and deserving of respect. Now, he did have a few things that wouldn't have resonated, but the idea of sort of opening up the access to the kinds of benefits that the elites take for granted, that's kind of how he portrayed himself and how they saw him, certainly in 2015, 2016. By 2020, he had to kind of change his rhetoric around immigration a little bit. He decided, I think, the calculation that the campaign made was that Black voters were sort of a non-starter for him. And so they decided to pursue young Latino voters. And they decided the way to do that was to sort of, he used to have a very hardcore stance against immigration. There's a really famous clip of Bernie, in 2015, Ezra Klein said to him, well, you care about poor people so much, shouldn't you care about the global poor? Shouldn't we have open borders? And Bernie kind of laughed in his face and went, open borders? That's a Koch brothers proposal. He used to be very into sort of strong borders. And so he really, in 2015, ticked off those two issues that working class people really care about, which is healthcare and immigration. But by 2020, he had to do this sort of 180 on immigration in order to cater to a kind of younger Latino vote. And I think running against Trump, it was very, the temptation to cast Trump as some sort of evil Knievel for believing in policing the border was apparently irresistible to all of the Democrats running against him. So in their mind, like that sort of populist view, it's very easy to see Bernie in that way. Now, the model for a leftist economy that Bernie represents is much more the one that's now very in vogue in progressive politics, which is let's raise taxes and we're going to take all that money and we're going to redistribute it. We're going to raise like the level of what it means to be poor, let's say from $20,000 a year to $60,000 a year, and everyone will get a handout, everyone will get a housing voucher, everyone will get free access to education and what have you. Working class people don't like that. They're not into redistribution. They do support raising taxes on corporations and on the rich, but what to do with that money? They don't want that money. They want it to go to things like health, universal health care or paying off the deficit, for example. So they have no problem with rich people paying more in taxes, but they don't believe in redistributing that. That's not a model they like. They like the Trump model, which is let's find a way to look at the economy as a whole. Okay, who's in the labor force? That's immigration. Who are we trading with? Are those trade deals favorable to us or favorable to China, right? Thinking about the economy as a whole and how to protect the labor of working people within the American economy and put them first.
And do you identify with either political party?
No.
Have you ever?
Yeah, I was like a hardcore blue Democrat for a really long time. Yeah.
So what like when you say that you had Trump derangement syndrome going into 2016, like what is the
So
what is it
embarrassing,
what does
yeah.
that like metamorphosis
Oh,
look
God,
like?
it was
When did you
horrible.
start to
So embarrassed. There's this bar in my neighborhood that I'm like, I'm a fixture at this bar, Wheeler's, the best place in Brooklyn, in South Brooklyn. And I just couldn't go in there because everybody there's a Trump voter. And like I'm
Oh,
embarrassed to
really?
even think how long it took me after the election to go back in there. And of course they like did everybody welcomes me back. I was like so happy to see me when I came back. But it's like I'm so embarrassed now. But it also gave me a lot of humility. And this is what I it's like drives me nuts. Like I, at the time, could not see what was obvious to 67% of white Americans without a college degree, which is that this billionaire was going to take the neoliberal ship, which was being pushed in this direction by both parties, and turn that ship around and push it in this direction single-handedly. Like, that's what he did, if you think about it. Both parties believed in open borders, massive amounts of immigration. Both parties believed in free trade. NAFTA was the result of both parties. It was a handshake agreement between both parties to sell out the working class. And one person, and leftists will admit this to you in private, like, yeah, on trade and on immigration, he was good. And they'll be like, but what did he really do for the working class? They'll be like, his one signature, when they go in public, they say, his one signature achievement in office was a tax cut for billionaires, right? Like you hear that all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's nonsense. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. First of all, middle class, working class people got huge tax cuts. And when you're making $60,000 a year and feeding 5 kids, like, and you get 15% tax cut, you're not sitting there resenting the fact that a billionaire got a 4% tax cut that put more money back in your bank account. You're thinking, my God, where did all this money come from? Wow, what can I spend this on? I can pay off my credit card. I could do this, I could do that. Like, and that is how working people, middle class people talk about those tax cuts. But I went off on a tangent, but you were asking me what it felt like to change my mind about Trump. It was extremely painful, extremely painful. It is extremely painful to admit you're wrong. And it is like the most basic job of a journalist to be able to do that. And it really hurts.
And at what point did that happen in the timeline?
It happened like very slowly and then all at once. Like the first glimmer I had that my side was wrong was I encountered a 2018 Yale study. And I remember when I first saw it, I printed it up and I looked at it and I kind of was like, and it seemed so dangerous to me that I actually put it in a drawer and closed the drawer and was like, I'm not ready to think about what this means because it implicates my whole worldview. I felt that way actually very similarly when I encountered Heather McDonald's work. I was like, this is the most dangerous possible thing a person can read. And if a person actually encounters this and takes it seriously, that person will lose all their friends. And that is literally exactly what happened. Because it is, to say, oh, actually Black men are not being gunned down en masse by the cops, right? Like in 2019, 2020, like that was a heresy so great that it was like political, not just political and social suicide, but professional suicide to actually take that seriously. And a few of us did, and it was brutal. I mean, it was just like brutal because so much of the media is on one side of things. So the study found that there's a difference between how white liberals and white conservatives talk to Black and Hispanic people. And the difference is this. What white liberals, when they meet a Hispanic or Black person, they do what's called present lower competency. So they dumb down their vocabulary to protect this person, don't you see, from having to encounter their highfalutin vocabulary. And white conservatives don't do this. And I remember I looked at that and I thought, and we call them the racists? Because it was like, it wasn't just that it's so racist. I mean, it's so racist. It's so disgustingly racist. But that impulse to see a person of color and assume they need my help, they need my beneficence, they need my protection, that underlies the entire progressive movement. And I remember looking at that and thinking, that's true, and I'm sunk. Like it was sort of the first moment, because then afterwards, okay, I couldn't look at it for a while. I came back to it a few months later, started thinking through things. I'm like, okay, so they're wrong about race, And the minute that sort of starts to, you're like, okay, what else might they be wrong about? Because there's no natural connection between being pro-choice and
Yeah.
a climate
Yeah.
change activist and anti-Zionist and anti-racist. Like, there's no natural connection between these things unless you've gone to college. I mean, that's the sort of the through line. It's the economic agenda of the elites, which they are protecting with all of these things. But the minute one of them falls, you start thinking like, okay, well, they lied about that. What about this? They lied about this. What about this? And then slowly but surely, you work yourself around to like, oh God, oh no, what if they lied about Trump?
And what do you, I mean, for me, when I think about reservations about Trump, my number one thing is, you know, I'm 24. I would like to live in a country that has like social cohesion and where people like their fellow Americans. And I do feel that he is a person that consistently stokes divides. I also think that there's false narrative sometimes about something that he supposedly said that when you watch the whole clip in context, like, it's not true. But I also think that he's a deeply inflammatory person. And even if I agree with some of his policies, like I'm hugely worried about what happens to the social fabric with another Trump presidency. How do you feel about that? Because it feels like he twists the knife in a way that sometimes just makes me, like, I think of someone like Trump supporters that I know and love in my family who like didn't vote for him because they were super brash and into it, and they're not super MAGA, but they felt compromised by their choices, and they kind of did it, and they said, okay, I hope that like the 2016 kind of bombastic personality is just a campaign trail situation, and he does us proud, and like then there's the embarrassing clip from 2 seconds later, or like you feel like you're always on the back foot justifying something that he said. So what are your feelings about, like, is he gonna pull us further apart as a country, even if his policies might be pro-working class?
I'm so grateful to be able to answer this question because I think it's really an important one, and I think people ask it like really in good faith. And in fact, one of the guys that I profile at length in my book, Second Class, he said to me, Trump did a really good job of representing us as working class folks, but he was so hated that he gave us a bad name at the end of the day because he became a stand-in for us. And so the elites started to hate us even more. And I think that's really true. I think before Trump, you know, the college-educated elites had a lot of contempt for people who work with their hands for a living. But after they got Trump elected, that like curdled into a real hatred because those people exercised, you know, their right to the franchise. And basically, in the elites' view, screwed over the elites in a big way. Actually, they're right. They did. He did change the economy from being one that was, you know, super rewarding to the elites to one that was starting again to close that gap between the elites and the working class. So what's the answer to that, right? Like, you know, is he divisive? Yes. Is he brash and bombastic? Yes. Does he love to pick fights with his enemies? Yes. All of that is true. He would not have that persona if there was not an unbelievable amount of vitriol and lawfare and rage and coordinated efforts to destroy him from the elites. You know,
but didn't he kind of come in with that energy too? Like before there was, like even just in the primary when no one took him seriously, like he was like shooting shots and doing his thing, which I liked at the time, a different version of myself. But like it does feel like it's not. I think it's certainly been exacerbated by the fact that he feels that he's under siege, but that does feel like that's kind of like an innate part of his.
Yeah, I mean, he knows how to generate publicity, right? He got the equivalent of, I think it was something like $5 billion worth of free press in the first election, right? Just by being crazy, right? Yeah, totally. I'm not defending any of that. It is obviously a big part of his personality. A different part of his personality comes out when he is speaking to a crowd like in the Bronx, when he went there and was addressing a very diverse crowd who were there to support him. And he became very unifying in his language. He talked about being the president of all Americans and how more unites us than divides us, and whether we're Black or Hispanic or Asian or Jewish, you know, we're all Americans. And he has this other side to himself. But the real answer to your question is, you know, being able to vote based on character is a luxury that many of our fellow Americans don't have. And he is the only politician who seems to really be invested in changing that. like in creating an economy that delivers for hardworking Americans. So, I totally understand people who say that, but if you're a working class person, like it's always been this divisive against you. It's just that now the elites feel it. Like the divide in which their futures were sold out to China and no one had a problem with that, right? Like in a very real material way, they've been suffering from a divide in which they were invisible. And so now the fact that it's uncomfortable for elites because there's a person who's representing them as opposed to our interests, I think it becomes a question of like, what is more important? That this become a less economically divided country, or that at some symbolic level, we can turn on our TVs and not see a person saying crazy things who happens to be the person shrinking the economic gap between the haves and the have-nots.
And what do you think, like, obviously I'm asking for a little bit of mind reading here, but like Trump is not a working class person by any stretch of the imagination, whether it's his background in going to UPenn or being as successful as he has been in business. Like, where do you think that motivation comes from? Is it that he was going around like RNC events and market testing and like his motivation is power in the end? Because it doesn't feel like his life story or his arc would deliver one to be like the champion of the working class, even if that's what his policies are ultimately doing.
I don't know him, so I really don't know.
Do you see that like in his messaging that he's verbalizing that I am like a voice for the working class? Because
yeah.
You think so?
Oh yeah, he talks about it all the time.
And you think that's like an earnest like?
I don't need it to be earnest. I just need the policy to happen, and it happened in the first administration. He really. There was a 4.5% wage increase adjusted for inflation for the bottom 25% of wage earners in 2019, and only a 2% wage increase for the top 25%. Like that is unheard of since like 1971. There's been no wage growth for the working class. And that was a direct result of trade wars and tariffs on aluminum and steel and getting rid of NAFTA and immigration. It's like the most obvious law of supply and demand. If you have more labor, that labor is going to be cheaper. And if you have less labor, that labor is going to be more expensive. And so we hear him talking about immigration, and to us, it's like, well, why is he so fixated on this? It's the number one concern of American voters because that has a direct impact on the wages that they're able to command. And in my book, I interviewed a lot of people, Americans, who are in jobs that are simply, they cannot support their families on anymore because they're competing with teams full of illegal migrants. And for the elites to sit here and judge these people for wanting the most humble, basic version of the American dream, stuff that we all take for granted, it's appalling. And he speaks about that all the time. He talks about people not being able to afford homes and why that is. He's got really creative solutions to that. He wants to, get rid of the independence of the Fed, which is when is the last time you heard a president actually trying to come up with solutions for getting more Americans into homes that would actually work and actually would stem from people being able to afford the American dream based on the fruits of their labor. They don't want handouts. They know they work impossibly hard and so much harder than all of these people on cable news who are telling them how great the economy is and lecturing them that they're racist and all of this. All of this language around racism and sexism and toxic masculinity, this is all designed to hide the fact that the Democrats used to represent working class people and they abandoned them. And now those people cannot afford to support themselves. They cannot afford to support families, All of these discourses that somehow men or being masculine or being macho is a crime. We criminalized mating, the mating rituals that have sustained humanity. For the entire history of humanity, those are now crimes. And just as the Democrats were turning their backs on working class men, being like, you will not be able to provide for family anymore, they came up with this discourse around toxic masculinity. It's toxic to want to be a provider and to want to be the head of a household and to be a man and to be masculine, right? It's not an accident that these things happened at the same time. These discourses were symbolic ways that the Democrats and the left were justifying abandoning the working class.
And so when you say that, like, it sounds kind of conspiratorial definitionally. Like, who are they? Where are they? Where's the coordination happening? Is it like
it's
in
not
the
really
DNC?
coordinated.
But
No, it's a really good. It's a good question. I mean, you recognize that this language of toxic masculinity exists, right? Like,
oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
It is mainstream,
I think
right?
it's ridiculous.
And then it
but it feels
started,
very
like-
academic and less policy oriented. Like in my view, it feels like it came out of like academia and overeducated kids.
Completely, yeah. But it was totally mainstreamed by the media, and this gets back to my first book, which is about how the media now is all made up of people who have multiple degrees from liberal arts elite universities, where they pick up all of this language and then they mainstream it into the culture. So yeah, I don't mean it to sound like a conspiracy, like the DNC came up with this. No, you're totally right to call me on that. I was like, I don't mean it that way. In fact, I'm often telling conservatives, it's not coordinated at all. These people just all have class solidarity, and their class solidarity makes them all operate as though they are in concert against Trump, but actually they're not coordinating. They probably don't talk to each other. They each just have this kind of main character syndrome, I'm saving democracy or what have you.
And certainly they never would have started with our first swing at Trump should be the New York case and not the Georgia case. It's the least compelling ones possible went first. So on the media front, have you seen any sort of market correction in terms of, I know your first book is about how an over-credentialed media has lost touch with the working class, which I think is certainly true, and I probably am biased in my personal viewpoint here, but I dropped out of college and the New York Post swept me up in a apprenticeship sort of way. And I wonder if there's kind of been a rejiggering of things, and if you think that the next generation of journalists might be a little bit more diverse in their educational backgrounds. It seems like, especially with the student loan crisis and the loss of faith in higher education, that we're potentially going to be churning out less kids with journalism degrees just in general.
I think there has been a little bit of a course correction. You look at the Washington Post, it's losing 70, million, billion, I don't know, millions of dollars a year. Yeah. And so I think there's the audience for the kind of hashtag resistance, kind of journalism that really peaked around 2015, 2016 through 2020. I think it's been identified and it's been captured, and there's always going to be people who are reading the New York Times and watching MSNBC. But for everybody else, they're either going to have to adapt or just kind of disappear because people are just no longer audience captured in the same way. What I'm seeing is something else that's interesting, in the independent media, a lot of the YouTube shows where they act like they're very independent, but because they're on YouTube, they all sort of end up sounding exactly the same because they get audience captured by the YouTube audience. And the problem with the YouTube audience is that it's not American, it's global. And so you have these shows that have this kind of weird global audience that has a very specific set, and they all end up sounding the same. So they all end up in the same ideology. This global audience, first of all, it's very anti-Israel. So they're all now rabid anti-Zionists. It's very libertarian in terms of its economics.
What sort of people are we talking about in your mind? What sort of YouTubers or voices in the independent media, just to put some general kind of face to the figures?
I don't actually watch a lot of it because it's so obvious what happened. I stopped sort of paying close attention to this. I was co-hosting on The Hill for a while, and so then I was really paying attention to it because I was like, oh, it's so weird that everybody in this space sounds the same when the whole thing that they're selling you in this space is that they're independent. But of course they're not. They're dependent on their audience. And so there's very little appetite to upset the YouTube audience who's very vocal and, post all these comments. And in a way, they're probably closer to their audience than someone on, cable news.
Oh, certainly.
Who knows ratings, right? But that's just a figure. They don't really get into the nitty-gritty of how people are responding minute by minute to what they're saying and what they're doing.
Yeah, I've noticed it even feels like some people in the alternative media space who have gone on their own independent, which I totally respect, but there is sort of a tendency that I think it's I dissent on this one viewpoint from my tribe and therefore I got squeezed out, and then now this one viewpoint that I have that's my kind of dissenty pointy view is now my entire publication or my entire Substack.
Totally.
And what happened to all the other kind of milquetoast things of your side that were there? And I mean I really think
it's really funny.
Being someone who's done YouTube shows or interviews on people's YouTube channels and stuff, and also is you on Fox frequently, the wall comes down with an audience in a way that I think is really important. I think it's great that commenters can actually get through to someone.
Totally.
But the audience capture potential is just so much more real. The barrier that's erected between someone who just watches you on the news and you take off your mic and you just go home and you don't really think about it versus someone's in your mentions or in your comments and the real-time metrics, I feel like that's a really perverse incentive. And I wonder, I think it's really healthy that we have independent media, but I feel like it quickly gets distorted in a way that's concerning to me. I wonder what you think of that as someone at Newsweek at an establishment publication.
Totally
too.
agree. There are certain now independent media personalities who are just basically a collection of YouTube comment sections. Their worldview is so tightly hewed to this audience, and I think to me it's utterly useless because I know what I could tell you before watching them what the YouTube audience thinks of this. Of course there's audience capture on MSNBC, on Fox or what have you. The only way to protect yourself from that is to have an open mind and be willing to challenge yourself and change your mind, and unfortunately a lot of these places, the incentives are against that. And I agree with you. I love independent media. I think there's so much great journalism being done on Substack.
Yeah, totally agree.
But there is this problem and people should acknowledge it. There's the idea that they're sort of in a different league somehow is totally nonsense. They're much closer to their audience. And, on the one hand, you want to be responsive to your audience, but on the other hand, it can be too much. And at Newsweek, what we did was something really cool. So on the politics news articles, we put a little fairness meter. And the reader can vote at the end of reading the article whether the article was fair or not. And something like 78% get a perfectly fair rating. And it's really important to be responsive to your audience, but it's also, if your whole political personality as a pundit becomes a reflection of the YouTube comment section, I don't have a lot of use for that. And it's also that audience specifically, I've noticed as someone who spent a lot of time interviewing working class people, looking at polling around working class views, it's very not American. So it's the average view of the average global citizen is just America is a very unique place. So our union workers, our working class is much more conservative than union workers in other countries. It's just, we're a very, very unique place, extremely tolerant to diversity, extremely proud of our tolerance. And that, it's just a very different, the thing that working class people want from the economy would not be identified as left by the global left, which is that sort of weird amalgamation we have here between educated, privileged, rich, basically white people, and then dependent poor people, right? That amalgamation, that's kind of the global left. The American working class wants something very different that, again, it's really astonishing that Trump identified that and then delivered on it. It is really astonishing. And it is, I think that a lot of people who can't bring themselves to give him credit for it, it's because it truly is invisible to them. Elites do not think a lot about tariffs. We just don't. We don't think about that stuff. We don't really think a lot about the cost of groceries. If you have a nice cushion of $30,000 in your bank account, you're just not looking closely at the cost of groceries, except maybe you're checking out. You're wow, that's more than I was expecting it to be. Yeah. It's just and I think that because of that, they truly can, and I'm like just begging people to recognize that someone with $50 in their bank account is not wrong about what policies help them and what policies hurt them. Like, let's just bring a little bit of humility to this conversation and stop lecturing people who are poor, and they're poor because we're rich. I mean, like, it's a totally like zero-sum game. We put in practice policies that made us rich and them poor, and then we called them racist for objecting. That is the story of the American left over the last 40 years, and it is utterly outrageous. It is totally outrageous. And no one talks about how outrageous it is because the right doesn't really want to represent these people either. Like the non-Trump right does not really want to give these people a voice. They just want to get back to the Nikki Haley version of like Chamber of Commerce, free trade, foreign intervention. And the left won't admit that it happened. So there's like literally no one will talk about this. It's like there's like five people.
And so a theory that like I have, and I mean, it's not original to me, but I'd be curious to hear your take on it, is I'm strongly opposed to a two-party system. I think our founders were right to warn against that path. And I think especially in a diverse democracy, you could not have something worse than a two-party system. And I agree with you that your position on abortion should have nothing to do with your position on immigration or climate, and it seems completely nonsensical and tribal and at odds with like a diverse pluralistic democracy just fundamentally. How do you think the two-party incentive and that sort of like duopoly situation created a left or a political left that seems to straddle completely disparate populations that it appeals to, and then create this sort of chasm for a Trump to kind of come in?
I think that for the left, they love higher taxes because it's kind of like an indulgence, you know, like a Catholic indulgence, you know, like in the Middle Ages, you could buy forgiveness for your sins from the church. You know, you pay a certain amount of money, you cheat on your wife and you go and confess. And then he'd tell you how much money it was, you pay the money, and the spiritual alchemy would kind of wash your sins away.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? Probably works, you know. But I think that the left, that's what higher taxes is for them. They love paying higher taxes, like especially rich lefties, like love the idea of being taxed at like 50%, you know, like in you know, Scandinavia or what have you. Oh yeah.
The ones that are actually doing it, or I mean, aren't they using loopholes, and don't they have fancy accountants? You think
I don't know. Go to like the Upper West Side, like, you know, like there's people there who go to the Hamptons.
Who are
people
excited
are like,
on tax day?
Yeah, they're like, yeah, charge me more. Like they're out here, tax the rich, right? Like they love to, but actually it's because like they have so much extra money, and like they know they're not going to feel it, and the economy is already giving them so much more. You know, it used to be
they're
40
probably
years
also
ago.
Withholding on their taxes anyways, so they're not even like, it's not even like it's coming out of their bank account. Like they've created their life around the
I'm so happy for you that
inevitability.
you've never met these people because they suck. Like they are.
I guess it's my generation, because like
suck.
everyone in my cohort who's on the left now is getting like their first like IRS situation
they're like,
rolling
"Where's
up,
my
and they're
money?"
like,
Like Cardi.
"What the hell is this?" Yeah, so I'm like, I feel like
That's
I'm still in that
hilarious.
phase of life where
no, these
like
people
a lot of
they're unbearable because they're like so rich, and they're the NIMBYs, you know, like they live in these houses, these amazing houses. They go to community board meetings and make it so that their cleaning lady will never be able to buy a home within a, you know, 500-mile radius of where they live, and then they, you know, support progressive candidates who like, you know, support these like, you know, Soros-backed DAs who want there to be like, you know, every criminal let back out on the street, and they support higher taxes because of course they do. Like, you know, they want to pay higher taxes for energy, right? They're like, no, there should be, you know, a billion% tax on every time you fill up your car with gas, right? Like they love that stuff. They love that stuff.
I don't know them yet, but I'm sure I'll encounter them.
Yeah, and and it's because it's a form of indulgence, you know. They just want the status quo to stay the way it is because it's done so much for them.
I think the thing that consistently Trump lets me down on is I want the like hesitant voter that might not be proud to go out and say I voted for him in the last election to be made proud, and to not to like it drives me crazy when he does the thing of like, I'm going to hand over, like I can see it from a mile away when it comes out of his mouth that this is going to be a soundbite on CNN and MSNBC for like the next 3 years. And it's like, why did you make the joke about the revenge tour to Sean Hannity? Like that is, did you see that clip where Sean Hannity said, like, I'm going to misquote this, but he said something like people are concerned that this is going to be a revenge tour, and he said, "Oh, well, not after the first day."
He said you're going to be a dictator, and he said, "Well, only on day one."
Yeah, and it's like, I know that that's going to be taken out of context. In what world did you not learn from all the other clips and misrepresentations? And there's good people on both, or fine people on both sides, and then that gets pulled completely out of context. And like, why? He's smart enough to know.
Oh, he's definitely doing that on purpose.
I know, and that's where I'm like, can you just make us proud? Can you not alienate more people? Can you give a good name to the people who like put themselves out there and felt compromised by their decision? That's where it just drives me crazy, because I know people who are consistently embarrassed to exist in liberal spaces as someone who voted for Trump, because he keeps on like handing them sound bites on a silver platter and embarrassing them by proxy. Does that comport with your
It doesn't
experience
resonate with
at
me
all?
so much because like the idea of giving the liberal audience who are misquoting him the right to embarrass me is like, never again.
Yeah,
you gotta think about who you're giving the right to judge you.
Sometimes they're also correctly quoting him, and it's like, why did that have to come out of your mouth? Like,
well, because he's trying to get that free publicity, right? Which is like the
but
name of the game in a presidential election.
At this point, Trump's got the publicity. He's not.
Well, let me make another point. Okay, so you're religious, I'm religious, right? And often people are like, how could religious people vote for Trump? How could these evangelicals vote for Trump? Don't they see his character? Don't they see that he's... And I think the point there is like, religious people don't take their moral cues from political leaders. Like, of course, it's nice to have someone you can look up to. But I personally don't, and most of the religious people that I know, we don't need our political leader to reflect our moral values. We get those from our community and from our parents and from our rabbi and from our spouses and from our children if we have them. And, and I found this very much resonated with working class people. Like, and I think this is, again, why DeSantis really failed to get any traction. Like, they're not looking for moral leadership. They are looking for somebody who will make their lives a little bit easier and who will create policy that will make them feel like less of Trumps, will make them feel like it matters to be an American again. They don't want to be proud of Trump. They want to be proud of themselves. And that has been taken from them by a system that Trump was the first person in 50 years to even see the system, like even to be able to see it, let alone actually manage to correct some aspects of it. And that's what he keeps promising he's going to do on steroids. And that's what they're listening for. Obviously it's nice to have leaders who are dignified and who you think, oh yeah, I'd love to pray next to this person. But to me, it's just so, like someone like Hillary Clinton, who's obviously like, a member in good standing of her community, like never says anything crazy. Like she was simply like, if she had been made in a factory to dispossess working class Americans, they couldn't have done a better job. And yet she did it all. And there's so much of that on the left, this kind of like, Nancy Pelosi, respectable, respectable norm, adhering to what have you, while dispossessing the working class, but then also very much using the system as it is set up, using like elite, things like, the legal system or what have you, to destroy a man. For simply being a very successful politician, right? They use these very polite methods of like actually doing things that are really unacceptable. So I guess I feel less bothered by this. And
Final question for you. Will you concede that if Trump came to you and said, should I change my tone or should I rise to the occasion, will you concede that that would be a positive for the country? Take the high road?
It's a hard thing to answer because his instincts have been so much better than mine from day one. I'll concede this. I really want this country to be more united, but the thing that I believe is that we already are. It's only the elites who are polarized. And in my book, what I found was that there's very little that polarizes the working class, like almost nothing, and that polarization is a totally elite phenomenon. And so in a way, we are already unpolarized or depolarized in the country. And so the way to make that more apparent is for the elites to stop fighting Trump, stop fighting each other, and just to elevate these people who are already living the reality that we have forgotten how to do, which is to respect people they disagree with.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I think I am still similarly confused by you, which is what I love about you as a thinker, because there's so few people who are genuinely heterodox and internally heterodox, and I really admire your ability to be a truly independent thinker in this space.
I admire you very much as well, and I'm very excited for the career ahead of you, and I'm so honored to have been here with you on your show.
Thank you so much.